I love quilting, but there are also some things that I hate about it. Can you guess what number one is? Hi, it's Hannah with Fabric Café. I've been quilting for 4 years now, and quilting is amazing. It's therapeutic and fun, and the gift of a quilt is such a wonderful gesture that can really mean the world to someone. But there are some things that are not fun. So today I'm going to share the top 5 things I hate about quilting, but why you should still do them and how I deal with them. So let's get started. Number 5, making half square triangles. This is lowest on my list because I have a love-hate relationship with half square triangles. I actually enjoy making them, to a point. When you have to make a bunch, they get very tedious. It's so much trimming and pressing, so it just gets a little mind-numbing. But I think they're really important in quilting. They are a classic staple in the quilting world. They add so much movement and interest to a quilt. You're able to make fun shapes that you wouldn't be able to do with just squares and rectangles. Even if they are a little tedious, they are a simple block that can be used to make more intricate looking designs. So I've got some ways to help me out when I'm making half square triangles to break up that monotony. My biggest tip is simply break them up. If possible, just make the half square triangles for one block at a time. For example, I'm making Evening Stroll, which has a lot of half square triangles. So instead of trying to tackle them all at once, which would be boring and overwhelming, I broke them up by block. I mark, sew, press, and trim all of my half square triangles for one block at a time, and then I make the block. So by the time I'm done with the block, I'm ready to make more half square triangles. I also use the magic ruler to mark my half square triangles, and that has been a huge time saver for me. Chain piecing is super helpful when making half square triangles. It makes the sewing go very quickly. When I'm trimming my half square triangles, sometimes I like to lay out a couple at a time. I'll get the trim on the first side of both and then rotate them to get that final trim. I'm not sure that actually makes it go any faster, but it feels like it does, so that's nice. If you can't break up your half square triangles by block, then just do them in smaller stacks. Do them in stacks of 10 or 20, whatever works best for you. That will still break it up and make it more manageable. Number 4, squaring up my blocks. Squaring up my blocks is another thing that I find tedious. The last thing I want to do after I make my blocks is to go back through all of them and make sure that they are all the exact right size. Unfortunately, it is a very important step. The more square your units and blocks are, the easier it is to assemble your quilt top. Because if your blocks are square, they match up better and are easier to sew together. It helps your quilt lay more flat as well. So whoever is quilting it will thank you, whether it's you or somebody else. I found a little loophole that makes this process better for me. Whenever I cut my fabric, I always use a square ruler. This lets me get it square when I first cut it. I also use a square ruler when I'm trimming my units from a strip assembly. This makes sure that they are the right size and it's only one step for my trimming. No need to go back and square it. Just like when making my half square triangles, I like to chain piece my units together, especially if I'm sewing a strip onto one side of a unit. Since I'm going to have to trim these apart anyways, I use this time to square up my unit. I might as well do it right the first time and save myself the extra steps. So, you guessed it, I'm gonna use my square ruler again to trim those apart. I really love my square rulers, if you couldn't tell. I will do this every step of the way when I'm making my units. Squaring up my units along the way makes my blocks easier to sew and more accurate. Because I do this, I actually don't square my final blocks. I know, I just said it was really important, and it is. I probably should square my final blocks too. But squaring up my units as I go does help a lot, and it doesn't feel like extra work. That's my little compromise so that I can get the accuracy but still enjoy the process. Number 3, seam ripping. Nobody likes seam ripping, but sometimes it is a necessary evil. You want to make sure that your quilts will stand the test of time. If you've got some weak seams that are too small, that could damage your quilt in the long run. You also don't want to have a whole row that is turned the wrong way if it's going to make you hate that quilt. You put a lot of work into it, so it's better to take the problem part out and redo that so that you're happy with the results. I made some criteria for myself on what was worth seam ripping and what was not. Here are some things that are worth seam ripping to me. Seams that are so small and off that I think it will fray and damage the quilt long term. If I have turned a unit the wrong way and my directional fabric is facing the wrong way, or if it changes up the design of the quilt too much. Thread malfunctions that will hurt the integrity of my quilt. Here are some things that are not worth seam ripping to me. Slightly crooked seams or little bunches of thread. And blocks that don't meet up perfectly at the points. Those things don't matter to me as long as the quilt itself is made securely. My advice for you is to make your own criteria of what is worth seam ripping or not. And if you do have to seam rip, find a comfy place to do it. Number 2, pressing single fold binding. Now, I love single fold binding. I like the way it looks and I actually enjoy hand binding it. Pressing single fold binding, however, feels like it takes forever. And I think that's just because it has multiple steps and you've got a long strip. But binding is super important to finish out a quilt, no matter what method you choose. It covers up the raw edge of your quilt and keeps that from fraying. And for single fold binding specifically, you need to make sure that you get that final step in the pressing so that you cover up the raw edge on your binding strip. Here are some ways that I found that make this task better for me. First, I will actually prep my binding right after I cut it and before I even start on my quilt blocks. I never want to do the binding when the quilt is done, so this gets it done and out of the way, ready for when the top has been quilted. You gotta eat your vegetables before your dessert. When I'm pressing my binding, I will do all of the steps for one section at a time. That way, when I'm ready to move my binding strip along to the next section, I don't have to revisit anything later. Then I just wrap it around a piece of cardboard and tuck it in a drawer in my sewing room so that I can start on my favorite part, block assembly. We've reached number 1. Do you know what it is? The number 1 thing that I hate the most about quilting is borders. I hate sewing them end to end. I hate adding them to the quilt and pressing them and then trimming them even. But borders are really important on a quilt. It frames in all of the hard work you did with your piecing and directs your eye to it. And it helps lock in all of those seams from your blocks. Even though I hate doing borders, I add additional borders to my quilts all the time. I probably add extra borders to 75% of the quilt I make because I think they make the quilt look really nice. So to make this important process a little bit better for me, I break it up. I sew my border strips together right after I cut them, just like I did with my binding strips. This way, my border strips are ready to go as soon as I'm done assembling the center of the quilt. Whenever I add my borders to my quilt, I always sew one side, snip the ends off with the scissors a little bit past the edge of the quilt, and then sew the other side on. This lets me stay at my machine and get more sewn before I have to press and trim. Those are the things I hate, but there are also things I love about quilting. I love picking out fabric and patterns. I love getting creative and changing the patterns up. I think piecing blocks for a quilt is therapeutic, and it is so satisfying seeing the quilt top go from just yardage to a beautiful piece of art. I will never stop making quilts, and I hope you won't either. They can really impact someone's life for the better, yours or someone else's. If you would like to see what some of my favorite go-to quilts are, be sure to watch the video that pops up. Happy quilting!